So welcome back, and now we're going to talk about public protest, or it's often called the anti-war movement, and you'll find this on page 274 of your textbook. Now, the way this is going to work is we need to tie this to particular questions. And if you look at the 2023 paper, in the 2023 paper, the question says, how did one or more of the following affect the US? And the anti-war movement is one of those parts to ask you how it affected the US. Well, it affected it quite greatly because it was the first real time in US history where you had quite a sizable amount of the population making their feelings known that they were against a war. And you had people who would eventually come home from the war who were treated as, almost like terrorists, that they went to a different country and caused terror over there, and how dare they come back here and expect to be treated normally. This had never happened in American history before. And that's the impact the anti-war movement has. Another way that this can come up, you'll see it in the 2023, the FAIRED exam questions. It says, how effectively did US tackle problems posed by Vietnam? So a problem posed by Vietnam was the anti-war movement. How did America tackle that? Well, in fairness, at the start it tried to tackle it by ignoring it, then it tried to tackle it through violence, and eventually it became like the public part of the public zeitgeist. It became part of the public opinion that this war was wrong and needed to end. So you can see the shift over time. So that's how we're going to look at this through the gaze of those two particular questions that showed up in 2023. So the first thing we need to look at is the public support of the government begins to falter massively after the Tet Offensive. Now, there were quite a few people who were against this war from a lot earlier than that, but mainly it was student-related protests in high schools and universities, mainly universities. High schools are a little bit more insulated places that you be very difficult to stand up and say if you were against the government in a high school because you're surrounded by a particular town that might be pro-army or pro-military and pro-government. A little bit easier to do if you get out of that and head to a university where you might be surrounded by a few more like-minded people who would be more educated than somebody who might be in a small town. That's just an education, from an education perspective. Nobody is making any aspersions about what those people from small towns might be thinking about other things. But in terms of education, you'd be more worldly, you would have read more, therefore you might have a bigger opinion on something like this, or a more informed opinion. The older generation who would have supported America throughout, let's say, World War II and then into the Korean War and in the early stages of this war, they support the government pretty much wholly because they would see it as unpatriotic or almost traitorous to try to go against the government at this point. Their opinion starts to change quite a bit following the Tet Offensive and the acknowledgement of the credibility gap between what the government is telling them and then what the actual truth of the situation is. So let's have a look and see some of these protests. At some of these protest marches, even some of them that were outside the White House, one of their famous slogans was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" LBJ stands for Lyndon Baines Johnson. The reason why they're saying how many kids did you kill today is that stories are coming back, not just from the soldiers who actually fought over in Vietnam and then returned. We're also talking about photojournalists who went over there and were taking pictures of what was going on, as well as reporters who were basically writing stories about what was going on and bringing that back. They were letting people know of the search and destroy missions, of the massacres that were happening of towns. And people were learning of this and going, how has this not become bigger news? Well, a lot of the reasons is that a lot of the news organizations don't necessarily want to publish those things if it's against the public will. When the public will and opinion starts to change in 1968, they start to publish a whole lot more of it because they're going to publish what they want their readers to actually see. If we look at universities again, how would you protest in a university? Like, how would you do that? Well, what you do is you have walkouts where students will get up and walk out of lectures as a protest about what was going on. Not really much else that students can really do Later on, you have lecturers will refuse to teach because of the policies of the universities that they're at. This becomes a bigger deal when the draft happens. Now, the US draft happens in around 67, 68, where they take pretty much your lottery number, your birthday, and if it was called, chances are you're getting called up to the army if you're within the age range, unless you could prove that you couldn't go because of a couple of reasons that could get you out of it. One of them was that you were at university, and the other one was if you had a medical reason. So if you were to take somebody like, say, Donald Trump, he got a doctor to sign off to say that he had bone spurs in his ankles, which would stop him from serving during Vietnam. So if you have money, you can get out of it, which kind of goes on to the protest music we're going to talk about a little bit later on. This leads to more violent protests as the anti-war movement goes on. So what we're going to talk about next isn't necessarily during Johnson's time, it's during Nixon's time in 1970, where you had Kent State University in Ohio. And at Kent State University in Ohio, you had quite strong protests against US involvement in the war. And the government then calls in the National Guard. Now, the National Guard is like the army at home. And 4 student protesters are shot dead by the National Guard in 1970. And this is filmed. This is filmed and then put out on the news. And yes, you're going to have a couple of people, or a fair amount of people who are going to say, well, it serves them right for protesting against the government. But there's quite a lot more people who are saying, are we killing our own people in this country for protesting this war? And that's the attitude that people will start to have about this war, how it's an unwinnable war, how public opinion has shifted, and are we killing our own people for exercising what the Americans would say their First Amendment right for free speech to be able to protest something? We can definitely see the shift around it. The other thing is the leaking of information around the My Lai massacre. One of the soldiers who was involved, or not necessarily involved, but around at the time of the massacre, wrote a letter to a newspaper outlining what happened at My Lai, describing how quite a sizable amount of civilians were murdered by the American military when they went in. That's kids, old people, women, doesn't matter. They were killed by this army. Now, the investigation into this was then published in these newspapers, and the pictures of what happened got out. And some people, as a part of it, were arrested. Now, a few of them were convicted, but again, they didn't spend much time in prison, because what happens in war, they're doing for the benefit of their country. But things like this that get out, you're kind of saying, how is that going to help you win the war? And it only fuels the anti-war movement. It only fuels public protest. And that is when it goes into the 70s, as Nixon is trying to pull America out of the Vietnam War. The next thing is protest songs and protest music starts to become a lot more prevalent, where people feel it's okay to actually create art that goes against the public will. You'll see Bob Dylan has created kind of music about the anti-war. We've talked previously about Simon and Garfunkel coming up with the mix between the 9 o'clock news and Silent Night. The idea that you're having a wonderful Christmas over here, it's nice and peaceful. This is what's happening halfway across the world, and we're responsible and complicit in it. But the one from Creedence Clearwater Revival, I want to focus on that, because on the next page, on page 275, you'll see lyrics. Now, the song is called Fortunate Son, and it's written by a man called John Fogerty, who fought in the war. He served in Vietnam, and when he came back, he creates the band and he writes about it. And he says, some folks inherit star-spangled eyes. Oh, they send you down to war, Lord. They send you down to war. The poorest of the people get sent to war by those higher up, will never have to fight. And when you ask them, how much should we give? The only answer is more, more, more. Because you're not supposed to just want to give your life to this. You're supposed to give your soul to it as well. Even those who survive and come back are utterly changed by the experience. It is not a positive thing for these people. You know, some people sometimes say, oh, if you join the army, you get to see the world and go to lovely places and do this. That's not what these people were joining the army for. They were being either joining the army as a paycheck to look after themselves and their family, as something to do when they left high school, because there were very few jobs, and not only very few jobs, but there's no educational prospects for people who are from a poorer background because college is so expensive in the US. Um, but that's not the only thing. When we look at this, he's aiming this song at a particular group of people. It ain't me, I ain't no senator's son. It ain't me, I ain't no fortunate one. Senators, those politicians, can get their kids out of the draft. They can get their kids out of these situations, whereas he couldn't get out. He says, I ain't no millionaire's son, in a different line, which is the Donald Trump thing, because he's able to get out because he gets people to back him, that he has, let's say, bone spurs. And he wasn't the only one. There was a whole range of politicians who would become politicians in the 90s and the 2000s who would basically get away with not going to Vietnam because of this. Compare that to, let's say, John McCain, who came from a military family, who felt the need to go to war and was already a part of the military when it started, and the suffering that he would have went through for his country. So that's the anti-war movement. Did it affect America at the start? Not really. Near the end, definitely, because it was a reflection of how Americans felt about the war, especially in the late 60s. And remember, don't compartmentalize. We're talking about the late 60s, that's counterculture that we looked at in the last section. We're talking the Summer of Love and the hippie movement that was completely anti-war. And it was feeding into this. And you had people who would be massively against the hippies movement in the late 60s, who then kind of agree with them in terms of the war by the late 60s, after the credibility gap, after the Tet Offensive. So with that in mind, remember, you have to link the information to the question. If the question is, what does it tell us about the anti-war movement? Just sweep through it the way we did it there. If it's asking you about how the US dealt with problems arising from Vietnam, this is a problem. How did the US deal with it? Well, if you're talking about the government, not very well. So that's public protest, and I look forward to seeing you in the last lesson, where we're going to wrap up Vietnam. See you for that one.